Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. My name is Roba Abbas, and I'm a visiting professor at Arizona State University School for the Future of Innovation in Society and a senior lecturer in the School of Business at the University of Wollongong, Australia. Together with the director of the Society Policy Engineering Collective, Professor Katina Michael, we are bringing you another live session in Series 3 of the Public Interest Technology Colloquium. Katina and I would like to thank Melissa Waite and Anna Reid for their logistical marketing and communication support. To give you a bit of background, the PIT Colloquium is an opportunity to hear from our global community about the social, regulatory, and ethical considerations relevant to the design, development, and delivery of technology in the public interest. The colloquium is underpinned by the PIT philosophy that is intended to draw people together from across disciplines to address global challenges. Public interest technology at its core requires shared meaning, which is translational. It is to be inclusive rather than exclusive. It is also transdisciplinary while respecting the disciplines. We would like to welcome our guests for today. They are Professor Yogesh K. Dwivedi, Associate Professor Denis Dennehy, Dr. Anastasia Griva, Professor Xenia Vassilakopoulou, Professor Ilias Pappas, and Associate Professor Matti Mäntymäki. In this session, we are delighted to be hosting leading information systems scholars, each of whom will deliver short presentations centered around the theme of artificial intelligence and the public interest, an information systems perspective. The intention of this session is to provide a preliminary exploration and mapping of the opportunities, challenges, and future of AI through multiple lenses and perspectives, which will be used as a basis for future discussions about the role of the information systems discipline as it pertains to public interest technology and the related principles and frameworks. We encourage you to refer to the previous research of our speakers for more on their respective projects and publications. And for our live attendees, please feel free to note your questions and reflections in the chat, and we'll do our best to address them after the presentations. We'll commence this session with introductory statements by Professor Yogesh K. Dwivedi, who will be speaking on a perspective on domesticating artificial intelligence. By way of background, Professor Yogesh Dwivedi is a professor of digital marketing and innovation and founding director of the Emerging Markets Research Centre at the School of Management at Swansea University in Wales. In addition, he holds a distinguished research professorship at the Symbiosis Institute of Business Management in Pune, India. Professor Dwivedi is also currently leading the International Journal of Information Management as its editor-in-chief. His research interests are at the interface of information systems and marketing, focusing on issues related to consumer adoption and diffusion of emerging digital innovations, digital government, among other areas. Professor Dwivedi has published more than 400 articles in a range of leading academic journals and conferences that are widely cited, with more than 30,000 citations as per Google Scholar. Thank you, Professor Dwivedi, for providing us with a framing, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Roba Abbas. Thank you, Katina, for having me in this colloquium, and it's very interesting. Obviously, public interest. Moment we are talking about AI in various contexts and from various perspectives. And I use term domesticating, basically. You know, the technology is there, but the technology has various undesirable traits. Now, that might be privacy issue, security issue, danger of misuse, bias. All these are undesirable issues. Basically, undesirable traits in this particular technology. So basically, domesticating here means somehow removing these traits to make it more compatible and aligned with human values and for beneficial to human being. And that's why I thought, okay, I'll just talk about briefly what it is. So I've already been introduced, but just to say that I am based in Swansea University, Wales, UK, and my primary research area is adoption and diffusion of technology. And more recently, I have started looking at artificial intelligence and blockchain related issues. let me just say what I mean by AI, and then I move forward to further with my talk. I refer to AI as an increasing capability of algorithms and machines to perform specific roles and tasks currently performed by humans within the workplace and society. Some examples of AI that we all come across often, maybe aware, you might know, include autonomous vehicles, chatbots, autonomous planning and scheduling, gaming, translations, medical diagnosis, and spam filtering. We all see everywhere, we encounter these in everyday life. And currently we can see the debate and evidence both in favor and against of such AIs, such emerging applications. At one side, AI is projected as a means to achieve greater efficiency, improve productivity and reliability, but counter arguments also suggest its negative impact on human life, culture, and society at large. Reality is somewhere in between, in fact. AI has the potential to have both positive and negative impacts. Which one it will be, it all depends upon how we will be regulating and managing AI revolution. And you can see on this slide, actually, two examples. One is suggesting positive impact, and other one is suggesting negative impact. The first one saying artificial intelligence has caused a 50% to 70% decrease in wages, and the other one saying how artificial intelligence is helpful for elder care, actually, in healthcare system. So, it all depends upon how we actually manage and regulate AI. It may have negative or positive impact. These slides present some warnings about AI from three leading authorities, and you probably all know about them from both academia and practice. So clearly there is a risk, and reflection of that can already be seen from various places. As you can see, the threat posed by AI to issues related to human rights, the United Nations Human Rights Chief has called states to place kind of a stop on the sale and use of AI system until adequate safeguards are put into place. And this is just one example. Several such examples are emerging, So I think it's important that before companies or public sector, whoever is, jump on to implement AI system, they really need to ensure that what would be any unintended consequences, what would be the threat to us as a human being in various areas. So, I feel AI is like, as I said in my first slide, AI is like wild animal that needs to go through the process of domestication in order to make it beneficial for humanity by transforming its challenges to the opportunities. How can we domesticate and tame AI? Again, I feel that it can be done by bringing robust public policies and regulations regarding development, implementation, and use of AI system across public and private sector organizations. I feel governments are too slow. I mean, technology is moving much more faster than any regulatory arrangements being proposed and put forward. So the progress in this side is much slower than it should be. And our efforts from the research side should also be, we can see in last few years, lots of work has started emerging, but I guess, more efforts should be put on the policy challenges, more efforts should be put on the undesirable issues of AI, how to manage them. So considering the ongoing developments in this critical area, we recently means about 2 years, we conducted a workshop, and discussion during the workshop led us to develop a perspective article shown on this slide, as you can see. This article has discussed various challenges and opportunities related to AI. The article has also proposed a framework for tackling public policy challenges related to AI. in this perspective article, we propose that for ensuring the safety and desirability of AI solutions, they should be evaluated on 7 key parameters. That includes diversity, equity, ethics, privacy, and data protection, misuse protection, audit and transparency, and digital divide, and data deficit. When we are looking at designing AI system or implementing AI systems, we should be asking how well does the AI system perform in protecting user privacy. AI system and AI network is nothing without data. And generally those data has lots of elements that actually poses the privacy threat. Also, how compliant or trained the AI system is in preserving human values of dignity, fairness, respect, compassion, and kindness for fellow human beings. Does the system have a preferential sense of duty towards children and vulnerable people like elderly, pregnant women, and sick people? How well does it value environmental sustainability, green energy, and sustainable living? Simple example, if one going to use AI system for discovering certain minerals, probably AI system would do a good job. But would that AI system able to assess what would be the impact of that mineral extraction if that happens without, control, without inappropriate amount and capacity? So all that things obviously need to be looked upon when we are deploying AI system. Also, how well the system is trained for diversity in race, gender, religion, language, color, features, food habits, accent, etc. We know that there are several cases where actually these issues have been projected in relation to AI system. How good is the audibility of decision made by autonomous system? Can the decision taken be explained? It's not AI system is not normal computer system. Normal computer system decision made by human. The computer only perform what human actually ask it to perform, what command human gives, but AI system will take decision by themselves. So what that means, if something goes wrong, who will be accountable? How those decisions can be explained? In fact, a legal requirement in certain cases where actually decision must be explained. And is it possible? So explainability issue is there. How good is the AI system in delivering expected results across geographies and across different societies? Does it work for the low resource communities? Does it work across the digital divide? Again, we see the north-south divide here. The developed countries has all well-equipped infrastructure, and they are collecting data that is actually fuel for AI since several years, while developing countries or, many countries that are not even accounted or considered as developing country, they don't have any infrastructure, they have no data. How they and their interest will be represented through global AI systems. So these issues really, make us think that, of course, these technologies, how effective they will be in current scenario, we really need to assess them. Has the system been designed to incorporate features that inhibit or discourage the possible misuse? We all know that especially AI system embedded in the weapons, and many other kind of technologies, where actually if wrong person got hold of those systems, can really damage a lot to society and to country. So these need to be obviously looked upon. As far as I'm aware, research related to public policy challenges is extremely limited. We're still talking about at conceptual level. So we really need to look at each of these issues in detail, using empirical work in field to see how actually these issues fare or works in practice. You know, and I guess even formulating, you know, many governments is still far behind in terms of formulating policies. And one of the reasons for not able to formulate policy is obviously lack of adequate information that can support those policies. And those information obviously can come from our research, academic research. So my obviously simple call is to obviously further research on these issues and dig out information that would be helpful to policymakers as well as practitioners. And also, I also feel that policy formulation should not be left on the companies and private organizations alone. This need to government has to intervene there because these systems are not simple systems. These systems have wider implications for society, and therefore government, not only involvement, but government should lead these things. And if you also see that government has two roles to play here. So government as a user, but also government as a regulator. Government as a user, more and more actually system will be implemented by governments for public service delivery in coming years. But at the same time, government has a responsibility to ensure that those systems and the systems that are actually implemented outside the government sector are actually abiding by the fairness and equity principles. So with that, I end my short talk, and I would be obviously happy to input in anything at later stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Dwivedi, for providing a wonderful introduction to AI and specifically the idea of domesticating AI. I think the article that you referenced, Professor Dwivedi, is quite important and an important one that I highly recommend, apart from the framework that you introduced that is valuable in setting the scene in terms of the AI-related research themes and challenges. You also invite contributions from diverse perspectives and individuals to capture that multidisciplinarity that I think is really necessary to address some of the themes that you touched on as part of your introductory remarks. So those pertain to both the opportunities and the challenges to ideas of value, sustainability, and the policy and regulatory implications. So we certainly look forward to building on this foundation and the introduction that you've provided into further discussions. I will move on now to our next speaker, Associate Professor Denis Dennehy. Denis Dennehy is an Associate Professor of Business Analytics and School Research Lead at the at the School of Management, University of Swansea in Wales. His research primarily focuses on the mediating role of emerging technologies and analytics in the context of information systems and its implications for people, organizations, and society. This research has been published in premier journals and conferences, including the International Journal of Operations and Production Management, the European Journal of Operational Research, Information Technology and People, and in IEEE publications, as well as many other outlets. He is a senior editor of Information Technology and People and a senior member of the IEEE. He has also chaired conferences and edited special issues related to information systems and emerging technologies. And today, Denis's presentation is about artificial intelligence, why context is key, and there are no consequences. Thank you so much, Denis, for joining us today, and over to you.
Okay, so thank you for that lovely introduction, Roba. And thank you also for the opportunity to present, I suppose, my own thoughts and experiences around research on AI. I suppose it touches on some of the points that Yogesh actually mentioned as well. I suppose, you know, when you asked me to kind of provide a working title, this is the title I gave you. And it's very much tongue-in-cheek, really, you know, and I'll explain why in the next slide. I just find it kind of funny that we as IS researchers are talking about a technology that has been around actually longer than the IS discipline itself. You know, like we know AI has been around for the last 50, 60 years. The IS discipline has only emerged since the 1970s, you know. Of course, there are consequences. But let me kind of set the tone here. So for me, I think, you know, AI is certainly a technology, and it is just a technology. It's an innovation, it's a technology, but it is going to transform how we live and work in the next couple of years. You know, I believe it's going to provide a transformation that our grandparents experienced with electricity. It's also, AI is a suitcase word. Taking this word, this phrase that was coined by Marvin Minsky, who was a pioneer of AI. He's very much focused on robotics. But, you know, like AI is a suitcase word. And the reason I say that is because in IS, when we talk about AI, we mean artificial intelligence. But I'm doing work with a company at the moment, and when you mention AI, it actually means artificial insemination, because of the industry they're working in. But they're also trying to learn to adopt AI as a technology. So that's some of my own dark humor, but you know, that's why context is key. And I think at the moment, AI as a technology, it does get a lot of bad press. But I think people are labeling it when there's actually elements of it that are very positive, and there's aspects that we need to improve on. But the reality is, AI is here, and it's here to stay. It's not going to change. It's not the first technology we've had issues with. We see the side effects of the web. You know, it came out in the mid-90s to mainstream society. Had been used in the military before that, in the US military. We're still grappling with the side effects of the web technologies, you know. Also, when I talk about, you know, the suitcase words, pre-COVID, I was going to the airport. I was actually going to a conference up in Norway at the time, up to Ilias. And the taxi driver was asking me, he said, so you're going to a conference, what do you talk about? What's the research? And I just mentioned AI. And he just turned around to me and said, and how about Dolly the sheep? And I was like, wow, you know, his understanding of AI. And he said, well, what are you doing about that? As if I did that test. And I just, you know, it's always stuck with me for the last 3 years, you know, that people's views and understanding of this new technology is very superficial. It's been driven by media, fake news, tabloids, and also some very good press. But I think, you know, we're living in the era where people just catch on to headlines and don't look beyond that. So it does get a lot of bad press. But as we know, look, all IT is not bad, okay? And I want to kind of draw some parallels between what we're experiencing now with AI and its potential with the electrification scheme back in Ireland in the 1940s, you know? And these parallels, let's look at some examples here, okay? So back in the 1940s, Ireland was a very isolated, very poor country. People lived in extreme poverties. And this new technology, an innovation called electricity, was going to be rolled out by the Irish government. And they were trying to tell people, this technology can transform how you live and work. But people had their doubts. People had a fear around the technology. Some people misunderstood it. When some people did get electricity put in, there were some of the housewives weren't happy with it because the bright lights were now showing dirt in places that never existed before because they're so used to the candlelight. And even in the pictures here, you can see, you know, when they're actually installing electricity, there's a fascination by it. People are queuing up in the street, looking at engineers installing electricity wires and pipes and cables around villages all over Ireland. So, okay, it took 20 years to have a mass adoption, but its adoption across the whole country, there's three key ingredients. There's leadership by government, there's public engagement. They educated the public around this new technology, and there are use cases. So the government didn't want people to misunderstand it, labeling it as all bad. And they were very creative, I think, back then, the Irish government, because this is what they did. They published pamphlets all over the country with different use cases of electricity. How you can use it in the house to heat up water, how you can use it so that you don't need to go with a bucket to get the water, how you can use it on the farm. I think this in itself was highly innovative by a government, back in the 1940s. And they worked with people, they worked with the villages. They even involved, the local parish priest to give a blessing around the power of electricity. And it became a status symbol for many farmers because they could now start going to telling people that I've got electricity, and it made them look very attractive as a bachelor. And I think this is what we're seeing with AI at the moment. We're seeing just the headline AI, but lots of people they're not aware about, well, how can we use it? But also, how is it being used at the moment? What are the positive use cases that we see from AI across all industries? And I think if we start looking at that more and communicating it more to people, not just within academia, not just within the IS discipline, but beyond the borders of academia, I think is so important, and across all aspects of society. And here's a study that was done. This is a report that was done 3 years ago by The Economist, and they had done surveys with 400 C-level management. And even back then, 3 years ago, they could identify the top AI use cases, but also mapping them across to the use cases by each industry. And when I look at these, I don't see any use cases here that I should be worried about. I want my bank to actually be using AI to detect fraud. Customer experiences, I use Netflix. Netflix tells me good movies to watch. That's a personal use case. But it's like we miss these smaller use cases around AI. We keep looking for, the use of AI in the military, the bad side of AI. And we know there has been bad use of this new technology. We've seen high-profile cases where researchers have actually identified bias in particular algorithms. And we saw 18 months ago a high-profile case in the US where a particular university was forced to shut down their AI algorithm because it had bias and was causing problems with profiling people incorrectly. But what's the consequence for that university? Nothing. So there are consequences for people, ordinary people on the ground, when we get things wrong because we're profiling people incorrectly. But there's no consequence for organizations, public sector, private sector, not-for-profit, for getting this wrong. So we do need more governance. Yogesh touched on it there. We need more policies. We need national laws, but we also need, for example, EU directives, on the ethical use of AI. We saw this 3 years ago with the GDPR that was rolled out as an EU directive. It transformed how we looked at our data, and it put the responsibility back onto organizations, not just the ordinary person who's using those services of the organization. And this is what we need around AI. If you're going to use this powerful technology, it has huge power, the responsibility comes with it. And if you abuse that power and that trust, you will be penalized heavily. And the value of having, example, GDPR is there's no room to negotiate. You get fined heavily, hundreds of thousands, millions of euros by the EU if you breach your responsibilities around your data. So for me, these use cases are refreshing. You know, we know companies are doing this. Okay, a lot of it's very operational, but that adds value, you know, and it's offering new experiences for people. It's offering new opportunities for new companies to start up. Yeah, some jobs will be lost, but that's the same with every technology. If you look at closer to home, if you look at the ecosystem just around Swansea, for example, in the university, look at these companies and organizations that are actually using AI highly effectively to develop a sustainable business model. You know, Swansea Bay University is using AI for cancer research. What I like about the Welsh Government and Business Wales is they're actually creating pamphlets to help companies look at what is AI and how can we start using it in our business model. And even in that image there, you can see, you know, you click on different tabs, you know, what you really need to know, how can SMEs use AI, your AI checklist. So it's educating people, because AI is no longer just for the multinational companies or organizations that have a lot of money. There's AI powered software that's being used by companies to improve their systems, their processes, their customer experiences. So AI is here to stay, but it's just trying to understand how can we, you know, make it fairer and more equitable to all members of society. And I think this slide kind of covers it, where this is one of the biggest concerns I have, not around the technology itself or of AI, but when you look at this recent report that came out only last week, the AI Index Report 2022, and they provide all the publications across the world by regions and so on, country collaborations and so on. But I picked out this particular slide because I think it's very interesting. So if you look at all the AI journal publications in the last 11 years, from 2010 to 2021, where is that publication coming from? Okay, we see, you know, Asia, Europe, and so on, North America. But for me, again, it's so disappointing when you see, you know, less than 2%, just over 1% of South Africa, you know, being represented here. So whose voices are we listening to? You know, Yogesh mentioned that they're about, you know, developing countries. Where's their data? You know, are we going to try and superimpose, again, we've done this in the past with technology, superimpose our interpretation and adaptations of technologies into different contexts that we're not familiar with, that we don't understand. You know, so we need to have an open discussion. We need to have all stakeholders involved. And when I talk all stakeholders from an IS perspective, we need more academics and organizations from developing countries engaging with us. They want to engage, but there are barriers there, and there's glass ceilings as well in many ways. So we do have a responsibility as an IS community to, you know, create a level playing field. I don't mean by just tokenism, hosting a conference in the country, for example, say, oh, look at us, we're fantastic. I mean, we need to start engaging with academics throughout Africa, learning the craft, their context, but also teaching them the craft, how to publish in the top journals and so on. Otherwise, we're going to see that brain drain that we've seen decade after decade happening in Africa. And this is just my final slide here. You know, we know fish can't see water, okay? I've talked about this before. It's the same within our discipline. We can become very much just wrapped up in our own little bubble, our own fishbowl. It could be an IS-centric fishbowl. It could be a research-centric fishbowl. And people are just so focused within there, they actually don't see beyond that. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I actually moved to join Yogesh and the team in Swansea, because it's multi-perspective research that's going on here. A new master's being launched, for example, in September on AI for management. The research groups are looking at technologies and AI from different perspectives, but also in different contexts. I think that's very, very important as well. So as an IS discipline, yeah, we've had great achievements in the last 60, 70 years, but we have a lot more to do. And I don't think we should just convince ourselves that we're all doing great research, we're publishing top journals, and we're having impact. We have a lot more to do, to make sure that this technology is used correctly, that we do step up and challenge governments, and we do challenge policymakers and big companies around the good use of AI. And that's it really in a nutshell from me. I'm happy to take any questions at any stage, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Denis. Such wise words and really important calls to action. I think we'd like to thank you for your stimulating talk and as well for highlighting the transformative nature of AI. So I really appreciated the comparison with the rural electrification scheme, so the public perceptions around that initially and the various use cases. And I think that's a very valuable comparison. Something that struck me in your presentation is I think that managing the extreme perspectives on technology in general and AI more specifically here and for the purpose of this session, so either AI being perceived as all good or all bad, is such an important discussion that warrants further attention beyond this session. So the question I was thinking as you were presenting is, how do we actually balance those perspectives and communicate those benefits, but also manage the risks around the challenges? So through the things that Yogesh mentioned, that you mentioned around governance and regulation, laws, directives, and so on. So I'll be interested to discuss some of these points further. Thank you so much, Denis. I will move on to our next presentation by Dr. Anastasia Griva. Anastasia Griva is a lecturer in business information systems at NUI Galway, and is also the interim program director in business analytics, also at NUI Galway. Prior to this position, she was the Marie Skłodowska-Curie postdoctoral fellow at LIRO, the Science Foundation Ireland Research Centre for Software, where she worked on applied business analytics in software development projects. Her PhD more specifically was on industry funded, and she has worked on research commercialization by establishing 2 AI and analytics startups. Her research interests lie in the areas of business analytics, artificial intelligence, innovation, and customer behavior. She has published in edited books, academic journals such as Expert Systems with Applications, Information Systems Frontiers, IEEE Software, and also Information Technology and People, and also in proceedings of major information systems international conferences. Today, Anastasia's presentation will ask the question, to black box or not to black box, providing an experience from the startup trenches.
Hi all, thank you for this invitation. Apologies for not being able to be live with you today. So I'm Anastasia from LIRO Research Center at NUI Galway, and today we will try to shed light on black boxes and explainable AI using some experience with startups. So to black box or not to black box. In this presentation, first we will focus on black boxes in AI and on the continuous battle on to black box or not, and then we will try to think out of the box and talk about explainable AI and what is each role in this question, and then we will see how all this affect a European AI startup on its operations both internally and externally. So let's first set the basis and understand what are the black boxes. So a black box, more or less, is an AI system whose processes and operations are not revealed to its end users. So this means that we are not aware about the AI method and the algorithm used, how many layers deep the deep learning method is, what is the training set, and how the AI algorithm works, and so on and so forth. So the only thing that we know is that we provide some inputs, and actually we are not even aware about whether all these inputs are used, and at the end we just receive some outputs. Despite the fact that this might seem convenient sometimes, it can also raise many issues. For instance, for the practitioners, it's not easy to control and understand why AI systems make decisions or exhibit certain and specific behaviors. Also, having a black box AI, the decisions are not actually justifiable. So sometimes we might not be able to distinguish a good from a bad decision, and at the end, we might not trust the AI system at all. So using this black box and say that, for instance, we are going to reject this applicant, sometimes it's not enough. As such, different and various researchers and actually practitioners have pinpointed the need of knowing what the AI machine is learning and why it is learning that, so that we are able to intervene and control it. So what it means? Does it imply that we should create glass boxes? Indeed, glass box methods can actually help us eliminate some hard to answer questions by showing, for instance, how a prediction or a conclusion was reached. So it is easier for humans to decide based on indisputable information. So at the same time, here comes the explainability. So this need for transparency and understandability of the AI systems has led us to the development of explainable AI, or else XAI. So XAI in essence is AI which can be understood by humans. But again, does this mean that glass boxes and explainability are a rule of thumb? Well, actually, the answer is no. Because companies are still developing black boxes for several reasons. For instance, they do so because explainability and transparency sometimes hinder the performance of the AI. Also, sometimes when practitioners are trying to explain an AI system, they might leave out so much information which can make the system less interpretable. And actually, some simpler AI algorithms, such as decision trees, are easier to explain, whereas some others, such as deep neural networks, are difficult to be explained. And doing so, we might hinder their performance. Also, another reason why companies are still creating black boxes is to protect some trade secrets, and in order not to reveal how their AIs work to the public. And from my experience in the startup, smaller companies tend to be more sensible with their AIs, as these are in essence their assets and their competitive advantage, and they don't want to expose it to others. And now some of you might wonder, what about patents? Well, actually, not everything is patentable. And secondly, not all startups, and in particular those in the pre-seed levels, might have the money to support an international patent. So trying to understand this world, let's focus on an actual European AI startup. This startup, let's name it TrackUp, which is not its actual name, has developed an SDK, or else a toolkit, which can be used in order to accurately identify the position of a moving object, such as an object, in-store environments, and trigger actions such as recommendations, different content, and so on and so forth. So this SDK uses AI. And the startup developed this SDK because in various industries, such as retail, gambling, and gaming, there is an increasing need to comply with in-store location-based regulatory requirements. For gambling, for instance, the operator should ensure that their users are within the licensed store area in order to place a bet, or in the retail sector, it is important to recognize that shoppers are in specific store areas to release specific content. Also, this is actually a result of a research commercialization effort, which might somehow affect our story. Before I proceed with the issues that I identified, here I would like to mention that the goal of this case is not to provide direct answers on AI assumptions, but to problematize us and make us think out of the black boxes. So let's take a look on how this AI black box works. So the company either uses infrastructure that the store might already have, such as some Blee beacon devices or such as some Wi-Fi, or otherwise they might install their own devices in the store. And at the same time, the company has developed a remote installation app in order to initialize the store and gather the signals and perform what we call fingerprinting in order to build the AI model. Then, after the initialization, their SDK is ready to be used, so it is embedded in the operator's application. And every time that it receives signals, it uses the black box and sends the signals in the black box. And the black box can provide real-time responses with the precise user's location in the store. So given this logic and given this toolkit and this service that they have developed, the startup was approached by an international retail gambling operator in order to embed their SDK into their application. So, although they made some first proof of concepts, and although they successfully ran some pilots to see if this works, the multinational client didn't like the fact that this startup was providing a black box. So they started having various questions, such as, is the user locations correct, or we cannot understand how it works, does the system achieve the best accuracy, and how can we be certain it is difficult to trust a system that it is not transparent, and so on, so forth. So at the end, they decided to test and to select some simpler solution due to the fact that this AI raised a lot of questions to them and to the company. So they published an RFP, a request for proposals, and different startups and even unicorns and tech companies applied. And some companies were shortlisted to run a pilot. But at the end, this startup had the highest accuracy. So remember that this is their competitive advantage. And the accuracy was important for the retailer due to the regulatory issues. So it was inevitable, and they would select this startup for this specific project. So I would say that here the battle begins. Because, however, and despite the fact that the accuracy was high, the concerns that the C-level executives had remained almost the same. So now let's focus on the startup and see how they reacted. They had their internal issues as well, because as I've mentioned, this was a research commercialization effort, and the AI actually lacked explainability. So the team was struggling in understanding the system and how it works. And it was not easy to prove that the knowledge and the recommendation extracted are correct. So they couldn't resolve the questions that the C-level executives of the company had. So instead, they tried to construct explanations based on the observations of the inputs and the outputs, and they did so because it was essential to understand how the system works, because new mobile devices were developed and were included. So this means that they had to modify their AI in order to embed all these new devices and the new device groups. So after this internal battle that, as you understand, it was really important, the creator of the black box, of the non-explainable black box, decided to embed some explainability features and to assist the team in understanding how the AI actually works. So this way they managed to simplify some of the code, and at the end this made the system faster, and they improved the system's self-learning capability in order to include and incorporate the new devices and so on. So, apart from this internal battle that this non-explainable black box created and initiated, the battle with the company remained the same. So the company initiated some efforts to reveal the black box. So first they tried to understand which is the right position to install the beacon devices in their stores in order to understand how this AI works. And they made the startup in training their engineering team in how they can detect the right location to place the beacons. Then they made the startup in revealing how they should install the beacons, how they should perform the fingerprinting in order to initialize the model, and so on and so forth. But this wasn't enough. They also tried to use various methods ranging from legal to GDPR issues in order to understand how this black box works. So in the contract that they were creating, they tried to reassure that all the data that the black box receives as input, the outputs of the black box, but also all the properties that the black box had, such as the device groups, are owned by them. And their goal was obvious, that they were about to conduct a reverse engineering. However, the startup denied to provide them with the ownership of all the data, and specifically with the data that their black box was processing. Then they tried to exploit GDPR and the fact that they should be aware of the data that the black box process in order to reach specific conclusions. And then they arranged several meetings with their machine learning team in order to understand how this black box works. So actually, till now, they are cooperating, and the company uses this black box. They are still trying to understand how the black box works and to reveal the black box and to perform the reverse engineering. But on the other hand, they know that this is the only accurate solution that they can use given the regulatory requirements. So as I've mentioned, the reason that I presented this case is not to provide specific answers to AI-related assumptions, but to problematize all of us. So if I had to give an answer on to black box or not to black box, I would probably have acted like Pythia, the famous oracle of Delphi in Greece, who always provided ambivalent prophecies. So from my point of view, there is no silver bullet. However, in my view, it is preferable to promote collaboration and create synergies between AI systems and human. And even this is not possible, and even it's not possible to understand a black box, it is important to create an AI system that has the ability to negotiate with humans. So regarding explainability, indeed, there is value in this, and I would recommend using AI algorithms that inherit explainability features. However, explainability is not absolutely necessary for all domains. For example, in public health, should we know how an AI system that uses image recognition to predict COVID works before we are willing to use it? I don't think so. Also, regarding the TrackUp startup per se, should the system sacrifice the accurate identification of users' position over explainability? Even if the managers didn't understand how the AI works, at the end of the day, regulations and accuracy were above all. So what the managers would gain in this particular example if they could understand how the system works? So from my point of view, it is deeply held in human nature not to trust something that we do not know or we cannot understand how it works. However, this should not affect the design of the AI systems. Closing regarding the startup and their internal issues, another problematization has to do with whether the system did actually lack XAI features, or the rest of the team did lack knowledge to understand how the AI works. So that is the question. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation, and thank you for the invitation.
I'd like to thank Dr. Anastasia Griva for preparing this wonderful presentation for today's session with a lot of thought-provoking insights. I'd now like to swiftly move on to our next speakers and invite Professor Xenia Vassilakopoulou and Professor Ilias Pappas to present their work on human-centered AI. To introduce our wonderful speakers, Professor Xenia Vassilakopoulou is a professor at the Department of Information Systems at the University of Agder in Norway. Her research falls within three key themes: So the first is studies on the dynamics and governance of information infrastructures. The second is on studies on the transformative potential of digital technologies and the implications for work and organizations. And the third is design-oriented studies with a sensitivity to user perspectives. Prior to joining academia, she worked in management consulting for over a decade, leading information systems projects within the services sector, mostly financial services. And her research has been published in journals including the Information Systems Journal, the Journal of Strategic Information Systems, the Journal for Computer-Supported Collaborative Work, and the International Journal of Medical Informatics, among others. Today, Professor Vassilakopoulou will be presenting with Professor Ilias Pappas. Ilias Pappas is a Professor of Information Systems at the Department of Information Systems, also at the University of Agder in Norway. His research activities include data science and digital transformation, social innovation and social change, user experience in different contexts, as well as digital marketing, e-services, and information technology adoption. He has published over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals and conferences, and has also been a guest editor for numerous journals. He is or has been a track chair on AI, as well as on big data analytics at the European Conference on Information Systems and the Americas Conference on Information Systems, among others. Ilias also serves as the vice chair of the IFOP working group on communication aspects of the e-world, and he's also the recipient of the European Research Consortium for Informatics and Mathematics and the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowships. The topic for their presentation today is human-centered AI, human-AI partnerships for the public interest. Welcome, Professor Vassilakopoulou and Professor Pappas, and thank you for staying up so late to present today.
Yes, well, good afternoon. I don't know, for some of us it's a bit late. Thank you for the very nice introduction. Thank you for having us in this very interesting panel and giving us the opportunity to share with you some insights and reflections from research, from our ongoing research, actually. So what we will try to discuss briefly today is how to augment human intelligence, enable human control, and ensure ethically aligned design in the context of public services. And we will draw from two projects, one that has been recently completed and one that is currently ongoing. And our premise is that the human-centered AI can enhance innovation, public confidence, and societal value. So that's what we will try to convey and discuss. So we are connecting from Norway, the south of Norway. That's where the University of Agder is, where we are both working. And the context of our presentation is AI in public services. And we all know that there is a growing interest for AI applications in public services, mostly with an aim for efficiency improvements, but also an aim for more proactive and targeted beneficiary to the citizens' services. And there have been several reports. Many good things are coming out, but there are also growing concerns related to surveillance, because we know that the public sector in general sits on top of enormous volumes of data about the citizens. And then there are also the more general concerns about fairness, about accountability, threats to human rights. And I saw that also Yogesh in his presentation mentioned this United Nations call for action, and which is really about the risks of artificial intelligence for human rights and the need for transparency and accountability. So as a reaction to all these growing concerns, that the way that we see it at least, there is this emerging discipline of human-centered AI. And the idea is that we can try to create AI-enabled systems that amplify and augment human abilities, so it's about augmentation, while preserving augmentation as opposed to mere automation, right? While preserving human control and ensuring ethically aligned design. And the roots of this human-centered AI come from human-computer interaction, from computer science, and from ethics. So all these baseline disciplines are in the background. And you can see that we have positioned IS in the middle of all this, because we think that this is really bringing a socio-technical perspective to AI. So all these human-centered AI discussions and this human-centered AI approach is really about a socio-technical perspective on AI. We think that IS, and especially design-oriented IS, is very well placed to contribute to human-centered AI. And this human-centered AI term relates both to the process for developing and deploying AI to ensure accountability and participation, among others, but also the outcome, the characteristics of the AI-enabled systems that can be trustworthy, human empowering. So it's about both the process and the outcome. Now, I think Ilias can take.
Yes. So, speaking of how we get to human-centered AI, and I think at this point connects well with one of the last points from Anastasia in the previous presentation on human AI partnerships, because we're speaking of human control versus automation. So a very high human control and a low automation would imply would be a category of human mastery, as opposed to high automation and low human control. So the computer will be in control. But then speaking of partnerships, we are aiming for cases where we can support, increase both human control and automation, creating what we call human AI partnerships. And with this in mind, we have been working the past 2 years on a project. The next slide. Yes, a project with the Norwegian Labour and Welfare Administration, short NAV. That will be the acronym in Norwegian. And what happened there? The organization, they had an open call for researchers, because they were working to improve the services that they offer to the citizens and how they interact with the citizens. So they invited researchers to conduct user studies, and through several iterations with them, we decided to focus on the chat channel. So how the citizens interact with the organization. And one of the quite popular services that we see in both in private and public organizations, the chatbot. So the citizen will chat either with a service agent or the chatbot. And then there's an increasing amount of research on how we can improve the chat channel to improve to give better services to the citizens. However, there is not so much research on the relation between the service agent that works at the organization and the chatbot. So, and that is where we saw through our study the creation of human AI partnerships and how we got there, and how service agents were using the chatbot to improve their the services that they offer in turn to the citizens. So if we go to the next slide. So going back to the human control versus automation. So now in the top left, we would have the human service agents. high human control. And then in the bottom right, we would have the classic chatbot that the citizen would interact with. And we try to design an intervention that will help us study the potential of human-AI partnerships and how we can understand it better, and how we can help the organization itself build further on this perspective and human-AI partnerships. Yes, thank you. So we, through a series of workshops that lasted about 1 year, and we had several workshops with service agents, with members from the IT and the management, starting from the problem definition and then trying to understand how they work, and workshops with several people from different with different jobs, it's called like that, at the organization. What happened in the end, we tried to study how they use the chatbot, and we managed to expose the effects that a guided discovery process has on service agents, and on understanding what they can do with the chatbot, and what potential do they see to the chatbot. So we adopted affordances because we were trying to uncover the actual possibilities that the different service agents see. And through these multiple workshops, we engage in a dialogue on how understanding the understanding that they get through this dialogue can be used for further development of the chatbot functionalities and maybe new service delivery processes. So what happened here, we were able to build joint knowledge with the service agents. Instead of ourselves as researchers analyzing the processes and practices in which we could identify the different areas for improvements and then explaining them to the organization, and we worked together with the service agents and the practitioners and the management teams, and we facilitated their own discovery process, doing a joint inquiry. And that was the first step towards what we call the creation of chatbot-enabled service augmentation. Service augmentation as part of human-AI partnerships. And we had several findings. What we would like to highlight today were two key lessons learned that came out. The first one was the use of affordances as a sensitizing concept. So the intervention that this was a theory-based intervention, and we chose affordances because it really fitted well with the goals of the project. And being able to see affordances, to perceive affordances, means that the humans, they're recognizing the ways that the technology features can be employed for different purposes in specific contexts of use. So, for example, one service agent may perceive action possibilities by interpreting symbolic expressions of the chatbot, by learning about someone else's technology use, such as other agents that participated in the workshops, or by sense-giving support from the technical team that can help users better understand technology. And helping users see such affordances that they would not have noticed in other cases really helps in accelerating innovation. And it is really important in such cases to be able to include in this process seasoned practitioners, experienced practitioners that can help generate new practices for transformative effects. And so being able to discover these actual possibilities is a key step for moving towards human-AI partnerships. And that was the second lesson learned. The potential of developing new human AI hybrid models. So there's a lot of work theorizing about the potential of human AI interaction and partnerships. And the findings here verify that and they give support on how a public organization can get there while increasing the impact on the public interest. And so one example on the partnerships was that the chatbot could contribute to the improvement of interactions with the citizens. First of all, by automating processes, that is what is happening now, but also supporting the service agent in their own tasks. For example, the chatbot could offer suggestions to the service agent while the service agent is talking to a citizen. And these suggestions could be sent directly to the citizen or could be edited so it would ensure faster response to the citizen, or as the service agents may be using the chatbot to quickly find information or to make sure that their knowledge is up to date because they were much expert users on using the chatbot, and eventually offering better services to the citizens. And now we can talk about the second project, Xenia.
Yes. So this is an ongoing project, currently ongoing project. It's long-term, so it will run up till the end of 2024. It's funded by the Research Council of Norway, and it's specifically about the introduction of AI in public services. We take a human-centered perspective, and it's an action design research project. That means that we're working closely with public service organizations that want to deploy AI-enabled services in real life. So there are two pillars in the project. One is about enabling human control, and this relates also quite well to what Anastasia was talking about. It's about AI intelligibility and the black box problem and how people can make sense of the logic and of the data that feed AI models that are used for the services that are being offered to them. And the other part has to do with accountability and ensuring ethically aligned design. So just to give you a bit of context, we're working on use cases. So here is an example. Let's take the unemployment support services provided by a specific welfare organization. So the idea here is to deploy an AI model which will help in profiling the different unemployed people that require support. This is not about automated decision taking. This is about providing this profiling as an extra information for the case workers that need to tailor the services that they offer to different categories of unemployed people. And there is, based on prior experiences, there are strong indications that some types of support, for instance, retraining versus counseling, can be more effective for different kinds of profiles. So in this use case, we have been discussing and designing how such service, AI-enabled service, can be introduced. And we have some initial insights about the special considerations and the challenges that need to be addressed in order to introduce AI in public services. And I will discuss quickly, go quickly through them. giving reference back to this unemployment use case. But they would apply in also different, and we have been discussing also different use cases. So one key issue right from the start is how to apply the purpose limitation principle, which is actually coming from GDPR, for repurposing, reusing personal data that are available within public organizations. So although GDPR is there and there are stipulations there, it's not straightforward to interpret and find what is the legal basis and what types of data can be reused and what types of data cannot be reused, and how back we can go in our databases. And this is a big issue that needs to be resolved right from the start when we are designing this kind of AI-enabled tools. Then there is the issue of what are the legitimate use cases that we can design for. So what is really the AI value proposition and for who? So for whom? So for instance, if we take this specific use case again, if the aim is to minimize costs by, let's say, reducing the waste of services that have been proven in the past not to be so effective for some types of unemployed people, that's one kind of orientation. Another orientation could be that it's not about minimizing cost, but it's about maximizing the impact and maximizing the benefit for the individuals. So there are different ways of working with exactly the same case. And this has to do also with the objective function and what you are trying to optimize at the end of the day. And then how to address different citizens' information needs. And this goes back to intelligibility. And we have seen that, of course, citizens are different. They have different levels of digital literacy, but also different levels of administrative literacy. So if you need to, and you want to do that, if you are, or at least in Norway, the government wants to deploy AI in a responsible way and be transparent as much as possible. The thing is that if you want to convey how the AI-enabled tools fit in the overall processes, you have to have a very good way of representing the information in a way that's easily understandable. And then when we want to convey the logic of the models, if you want to show, for instance, the features importance, if you want to convey information about the data that are fed, the way that you're doing that it's quite tricky because you have to cater for many different types of citizens, and you have to have a way of communicating that can accommodate the needs of very diverse audiences. So these are some early insights that are coming from our projects, and the challenges that we think that are quite specific actually to AI in the public sector. So the issues that relate to catering for all, designing for all citizens, that's a very particular problem. And the legitimate AI uses, it's also quite particular. And of course, the special position of the public sector that has such a wealth of information is something that we think is quite particular also. So that was what we wanted to present today. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Vassilakopoulou and Professor Pappas. That was such a great overview of human-centered AI and of your projects. And I think I'll share your view one of the views, at least, you suggested in your presentation that design-oriented information systems research, and I think the IS discipline in general, is well positioned to contribute to human-centered AI, given the intersection of the areas you mentioned, such as computer science and human-computer interaction and ethics and so on. But also the value of dialogue in the further development of these systems. And we've seen so many real-world examples, certainly here in Australia, where that lack of human centricity and the lack of dialogue had such undesirable consequences. So I just want to note that your research and your projects are so very much valued and required. There's additionally so much to unpack in your presentation and the projects you shared. So I would encourage anyone here or anyone who's viewing this recording who is interested in a more detailed view of the topic presented by Professors Vassilakopoulou and Pappas to look to YouTube, as Professor Yogesh Dwivedi has recently hosted a seminar in which the topic that was provided today is discussed in greater detail. I think what I might do in the interest of time is to turn to the audience for one or two more questions. We will also extend the session to provide an overview of Professor Matti Mäntymäki's presentation for anyone who can stay post that, but we're very conscious of how late it is for our speakers. So I encourage any of our audience members to pop any questions they have, any reflections in the chat window. Would you like to provide a few words and then I can come in? And I've got so many questions, I'm not sure where to start, to be honest.
Wasn't it an incredible panel session, and we look forward to Matti's presentation in a moment as well. What a storyline today, Roba. We begin with Yogesh, who really outlined deep max and a lot of the importance of diversity. We then moved on to Denis, who pointed to us to the positives of AI in the public interest, but this deficit in sub-Saharan Africa and so many other places where much innovation could be occurring is not for a variety of reasons, but how we can overcome that. Then we saw this brilliant presentation from Anastasia Griva, really give us an important tracker application-based services perspective on what is really going on when we try to pinpoint a location of an end user, right through to this amazing contrast presented by Ilias and Xenia. And I have to say, perhaps my favorite talk, but I'm a bit biased because of the topic. It's exactly what we have to be asking. In fact, the work of your second case study could be used in teaching governments what they should be doing when they're adopting AI. As someone made the point, I think it was you, Yogesh, government can be regulator and government can also be user. And Xenia, how incredibly you articulated that. But also we see Ilias, that incredible human to computer interaction where the service agent together is an enabler with the chatbot. And a lot of people are now, deferring to the chatbot instead of wanting to talk to the human, but the human always comes in when the chatbot can't answer that semantic question that we burgeon and require at odd hours of the night. But a really amazing focus on human-centered design by you two, which for us, it was total education today to hear this. But this is exactly what we have to be teaching our students. This is exactly what we have to be teaching people who adopt AI. And Matti's presentation will cover governance of AI, particularly in organizations. And an organization can be a government agency and can be a private enterprise or an NGO or a not-for-profit. So those are just some remarks, Roba. I'm just amazed at this panel, and I see a lot of future research opportunities for all of us together.
Likewise, thank you so much, Katina. I think you're quite right there. I like how you brought up the element around education. And I think, Denis, you mentioned that as part of, in passing, as part of your presentation, and the education component and how that's really important. But something I think that everyone alluded to and highlighted was the importance of a multi-stakeholder view and the roles that those stakeholders would assume. So, for instance, Professor Dwivedi mentioned, as Katina suggested just now, that government can assume many different roles. And I think that's quite challenging. We do have a question in the chat, and then I'll come in with perhaps one final question of my own. So this is from Marika, who says, many thanks for the presentations. Regarding the last one, I was wondering if you could provide some examples of chatbot affordances and explain how perceiving these affordances supported service agents in their work. Excellent question. Professor Vassilakopoulou and Professor Pappas.
Yes, thank you. This is always a classic question that, and then on purpose we avoid to talk about the affordances because it's yeah, and then we have something to talk about when the questions come. So actually we identified 6 affordances, and some are more trivial than others, such as the informing part, for instance, which is something that the chatbot will do anyway, or then the multitasking, or the delegating, or distilling information. So the chatbot can be able to distill information from, let's say, for example, a lot of text that comes from the service agent, from the citizens, and give that in a more easy to handle manner to the citizens, to the service agent. I'm sorry, it's getting a bit late over here. What was really cool was that when the service agents told us, oh, you know what, we use the chatbot ourselves while we talk to the citizens, because it's a much faster way to find information. And because the service agents, as experts, they can use just the keywords to run the chatbot, right? So you don't need to form sentences or anything. If you know how to use a chatbot as an expert, you just write that one keyword and you get the information pretty fast. So, and that's why it's good to have these experienced users in such studies. And they said, oh yeah, we use it in parallel. So they have a chatbot window and a couple of citizen windows. So they find information, and that is important because the chatbot will always have up-to-date information, but maybe the human may have forgotten something, or regulations maybe they have changed. So maybe they're not sure, they have to double check, they talk to several people, so they may forget a bunch of different things. And the chatbot, although may has up-to-date information, but what they lack in empathy, what they lack in understanding context, is what the human can handle very well. That's why the human can give much better services. But then the human abilities are augmented by having a chatbot as a personal assistant in a way that can use quickly, easily. And the benefit of the project, of this specific project, I think we will soon be able to have the published version of it, hopefully very soon. It was not the affordances themselves, but it was the process of sensitizing service agents on how they can identify affordances, on what they can do with the chatbot. So different processes and how we help them understand what they can do with the chatbot, and then maybe they can do this again, and maybe they can feel more comfortable or more confident in using the chatbot, and this can lead to new functionalities and or new services offering to citizens, for example.
Thank you so much, Ilias, for that detailed response. Professor Vassilakopoulou, I had a question sort of slightly unrelated to that, but on the same projects. Was there something in your deployment of these human-centered AI design processes that you found challenging, or something that surprised you in actually being on the ground and working with the agents, or working in that particular context across the 2 projects?
Well, what was surprising? I mean, okay, I need to reflect, because of course, for instance, well, already what Ilias was mentioning, the thing that the agents themselves were so eager to try to find ways to collaborate, and viewing actually the chatbot as a co-worker. That was really interesting. And one of the first things was, yes, and from the moment that Frida, that's the name of the chatbot, was introduced, Frida has helped us enormously. And I mean, this view of the chatbot as a co-worker was quite interesting. But then thinking of the other project, what I find not surprising, but it still puzzles me, is that even when we have regulations in place, and even when we have organizations that really want to be lawful, of course, and responsible, it's so difficult to interpret and position yourself within the frame that the regulations are giving. So it's not really straightforward. It's not that, okay, we have some regulations in place, and then it's a matter of implementing the regulations. It's much more complicated than that. I have been amazed by the efforts that they have been doing up to now, working with their legal experts, working together with the Data Protection Authority in Norway. A lot of effort goes to making sense and positioning within the regulations. I would suspect it, but I wouldn't imagine how, and this is of course also something that can cause delays, a lot of uncertainties. It's a major issue, and it cannot be easily resolved, of course.
Absolutely.
Just to add here briefly that we are talking here about an organization that has a really strong focus on research internally. And I'm not sure how common that is in maybe in other countries or in other organizations, but in Norway, the welfare organization is funding its own projects, a public organization, right? Funding its own projects just to improve the services that they offer to the citizens. And for me, that on its own is very surprising, like in a very positive manner. And they invest so much time and effort with us and working with us, and a series of workshops that with findings that go beyond these research projects, and hopefully we can publish them as well eventually. That is surprising for me.
Thank you so much, Ilias, for that. The reason, or the main reason why I ask, is in our experience of any kind of collaborative, deliberative processes, there are always these unexpected things. So I was quite surprised when I first embarked on working human-centered co-design kind of processes, just how long these processes take, how resource intensive they are, and how difficult it is. You mentioned the idea of interpretation, Professor Vassilakopoulou. I think that's key. It's an interpretation of regulation, it's an interpretation of competing interests, it's the management of competing interests, and just so much more. So thank you so much for sharing some of those insights with us. We really look forward to publications. We look forward to trying to learn from your work in these projects, particularly in our context, because we've had examples within the Australian context, as I mentioned earlier, where these systems didn't go according to plan. And if you narrow it down, it was the lack of alignment in objectives between what the government wanted and what the users or citizens required. And as you said, Ilias, I think if they're investing and funding in this, that's a really good signal for how they're thinking about human-centered design, or humans in general, which is just so encouraging. So I think there's hope in that regard. I might turn my attention to Associate Professor Denis Dennehy to talk about, sorry, Katina, just for one moment, to talk about your new Masters in AI. Perhaps Professor Dwivedi might also like to shed light on this. I think the education component is something we really need to address in line with all of these other areas that we discussed. So stemming from all of your discussions, you alluded to education, the need for certain business models that support these kind of processes and this kind of research. We heard about the role of government and so on. What steps can we take as a higher education institution, as educators, for example, Denis, as a step in the right direction to contribute to this discussion about artificial intelligence, the public interest, values, how we design and develop better systems?
Sure. Well, I think first we have to acknowledge that it's taxpayers' money that's funding our research and paying our salaries. So we do have a responsibility to share that research and the work that we do with the taxpayer. they're part of that ecosystem. And we can do that very easily. We can do symposiums at a regional level, national level. Don't charge people for these events. Just open day events for the public to come in and learn from the research that's going on in their local university. We need to understand that not everybody can afford to go to university to study, particularly at postgraduate level. At any level in university is a privilege. So providing supports for people to access third level education and start looking at micro credentials, that you don't have to sign up for a 4-year degree or, for 4, 5, 6-year PhD, do it in piecemeal parts. Is going to benefit society. It also is going to educate people around technologies, for example. Don't just focus on technology itself. Look at how do we get the business value and social value from these technologies. And I think the project that Ilias just mentioned there in his presentation, like for me, that's a brilliant element for executive education. It's very practical and it's showing business people how to get value from this technology. So there's lots of key takeaways there for a module for CPDs, continuous professional development. I suppose I'll hand it over to Yogesh maybe to talk about the masters on AI that's going to be launched this September. Maybe if you want to talk about the masters, Yogesh.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously thought about, business students, if they don't have any element of AI nowadays, their degree is not complete in one sense. And when I talk about AI, obviously we have computer science department, which is actually teaching all technical stuff. So it's not that we have lack of content on that side. But what we wanted is that our business students should have critical appreciation of these emerging technologies. What are the applications of this technology? What are the main challenges and opportunities for them going forward? So for that reason, we haven't launched full-fledged master program, but we have created a pathway. So the master's is basically MSc in management, and a specialization is pathway, where we are actually have introduced 2 modules. One is on artificial intelligence fundamentals, challenges and opportunities, and the second one is AI in practice, where our plan is to bring the speakers from industry in each session, and they give talk on particular use case or particular aspect, and then obviously ask students to challenge or actually reflect on those things. So this is what we actually have come up with, 2 modules for begin with, but our plan is obviously to expand and probably create a full-fledged master program in AI. And I think Denis told earlier, and some of other speakers mentioned that, see, AI is not here since 2 years or 3 years, it's been 60 years. It has seen many ups and downs, right? And but the thing is that now is the time. It has all conducive thing. It has data, it has technology, processing power, and everything. So now AI not going to go back, not going to go down. It will further. And that's where it's very important that we actually prepare our next generation for this emerging opportunity. Also threat, both need to be managed. You see that, people have to reskill, and if they don't know what kind of opportunities and challenges they're going to face, forget the reskilling. And I guess this is just a very humble, very kind of small step we have taken to begin with. So that's AI master's in management specialization with AI, artificial intelligence. As Denis mentioned, it will be starting from September. So, and we definitely have aimed to expand it further. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you so much, Professor Dwivedi. What I really appreciate about the structure of this master's program and the course is that intersection of theory and practice, and looking forward proactively to skilling our next generation. And we often have these discussions, certainly Katina and I and our team at large, of often we miss that educational component and we teach in a very traditional sense. So, for example, Katina and I have taught in engineering schools, and there's a specific way to teach, and rightly so. But the requirement for multi and transdisciplinary research and for tackling these opportunities and challenges in the context of AI is such that we cannot revert to these, I guess, outdated models. So thank you so much for sharing information about that. Please go ahead, Professor.
And just to say that, obviously, given that we have lots of content, lots of modules on AI in our computer science department. So if any student who actually get into it and want really more content, they can actually elect module from our computer science department. So basically we are giving 2 modules, but then they have opportunity to take more modules from other schools. That's the kind of thoughts. Generally, business student doesn't want too much of technical content, but then there are some students who really want. So this possibility is there, basically. Yeah, that's all.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And I think I'm providing this multidisciplinary skill set where you do have even some individuals, not necessarily the entire cohort, who are able to translate between the technical and non-technical disciplines. It's just so crucial. And I think you have facilitated that through the ability to encourage computer science skill sets to be embedded within your own curriculum. I really look forward to seeing how this program pans out and to hearing more. Thank you so much to our panel for your insights, for your experience, and for sharing your time with us. We do appreciate that it's incredibly late on your end. We will be staying back for anyone who's interested. We have Associate Professor Matti Mäntymäki's talk, and then we will close, but we really appreciate your time. We will have the proceedings of this talk up on the School for the Future of Innovation in Society's website. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us, and also to our attendees. For those of you who do need to leave because of the time, please feel free to go ahead. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Robert. Thank you, Katina. I will leave now. It's getting now midnight, so thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dwivedi.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for all of you who have stayed back. We will now hear from our last speaker, Associate Professor Matti Mäntymäki. Matti is an Associate Professor of Information Systems Science at the University of Turku in Finland and the lead researcher of the Digital Economy and Society Research Group. He holds a Doctor of Science in Economics and Business Administration, also from the University of Turku. His research focuses on digital economy, including areas such as governance of artificial intelligence, blockchain ecosystems, and freemium consumer behavior. He has also authored more than 100 academic papers, publishing in outlets such as the Information Systems Journal, Technological Forecasting and Social Change, the International Journal of Information Management, the Journal of Business Research, Journal of Systems and Software, and so many others. Professor Mäntymäki has led several industry academia research projects and has consulted technology companies. And he's also currently the principal investigator of the AI GA research project that explores AI and governance in addition to auditing. Matti's presentation will consider how we go from ethical principles to governed AI.
Greetings from Finland. My name is Matti Mäntymäki, and I'm an associate professor of IS at University of Turku. Within the next few minutes or so, I would like to share some thoughts based on our research around AI governance. My team and myself, we have been doing this journey since 2019 with our corporate and academic partners. So I think I will mostly talk about 2 themes. First of all, why should we care about AI governance? or should we? And second, how do we see AI governance, what it might be, what it might entail? So the purpose here is to give you a bit of flavor of the topic as such and our research activities around this topic. As we all know, use of AI has increased a lot in the recent years. AI has also made, I think, quite fast inroads to also high-risk application areas such as healthcare, finance, traffic, and so on. Of course, not to mention military AI applications. There have also been several widely reported incidents of AI systems operating in, for instance, say, a discriminatory manner. You all might know the headlines about Amazon's recruitment system, the parole algorithm in the US court system, and many other cases like this. All this, I think, has increased the public awareness regarding the importance of AI being ethical. So there has been a surge of ethical principles for AI published by organizations such as the EU, UK's House of Lords, the OECD, as well as professional bodies such as IEEE, and of course, several companies. The most recent version of Algorithm Watch listing includes, I think, 173 this type of ethical guideline documents published. On the policy side, OECD's AI policy document repository lists something like 600 policy documents laid out by countries, states, territories, and so on. The most common ethical AI principles include things like fairness, transparency, non-malfeasance, responsibility, privacy, and so on. So I think it might be fair to say that shortage of ethical principles and guidelines for AI systems is really not a huge problem nowadays. At the same time, there is, however, a quite well-documented gap related to translating these ethical principles and guidelines into practice. Broadly speaking, this is the so-called translation problem of AI ethics. And this is kind of the problem with which we have been working on over the 2 years or so. So what I've said so far, I think, is maybe not entirely something that exists only in my head, but maybe there could be something that resonates with the rest of the universe as well. Things related to responsible AI governance are coming increasingly to the corporate agendas as well. One indication of this, I think, is the emergence of roles such as head of responsible AI and so on. From the investor side, ESG aspects are gaining a lot of importance. The current ESG criteria focus on environmental issues, social issues, so use of child labor, for instance. But issues related to consumers' data protection, privacy, and so on are also increasingly, I think, making inroads to the ESG investment table. And I think it's fair to say that investor pressure is generally very much something that affects on how companies behave themselves. So all in all, I would think we see there a growing momentum and certain practical relevance for research and activities around AI governance. So that was a bit of things why AI governance, what might matter. Let's now move forward and discuss a bit what AI governance might mean. AI systems are increasingly autonomous and can make inferences and decisions based on data without human intervention. Today's AI can challenge traditional ideas of IT governance that are about ensuring desirable human behavior in the use of IT systems. Increasingly, the behavior of AI systems themselves need to be governed. And we can maybe even think of AI helping in governing kind of human behavior. So, but altogether, with AI governance, what I mean and what we have been focusing on is the governance of AI, not governance with AI. So this is kind of the vantage point that we have adopted, and this is what I will speak about. Things related to governing AI systems, they take place on different levels. As I come from Finland, the European Union is, of course, a key actor in all technology regulation in Europe. GDPR, you might have heard of. That has now been in effect for some years. And now the European Commission is preparing the European AI Act, which will kind of be part of the same continuum with GDPR in terms of technology regulation. Of course, then, besides the European level, for instance, in the Nordic countries, we generally believe in a bit stronger role of the state than maybe people, or some people at least in the US or so, might believe in. So there is also national level regulation affecting AI in place, for instance, related to discrimination based on gender, political orientation, and so on. And I think same kind of regulation is in effect in many, let's say, Western countries. So now if you consider kind of all this, there can be quite a bit of stuff already in the regulation stack, so to speak, with respect to governing AI systems. Now with our doings and research, we focus on governing AI system at an organizational level. So we have adopted a vantage point of an organization that deploys some form of advanced algorithmic systems, say machine learning, in its business operations, particularly in the customer interface. So there might be implications related to discrimination, for instance, if things don't go as planned. The point here maybe I would like to make is that governing AI system is not an isolated exercise. It is very much a part of the overall governance structure of an organization. Now, why do we actually need something like AI governance? Wouldn't IT governance or data governance cover AI systems already? I would say that AI systems have certain distinct characteristics compared to other IT systems that need specific attention from the organization deploying AI. For instance, the fact that AI systems learn from the data and adapt themselves based on the data, make them quite dynamic, I would say. this self-learning, self-adapting nature of AI as such, I think, is something that needs to be considered from a governance perspective. Second, if you think of today's AI systems, they are very often, maybe mostly, impossible for any layperson, even for a technical expert, to make really sense of. And the more advanced algorithms we use, the greater this so-called black box problem of AI kind of becomes. Third, I think the very idea of AI system is to be highly scalable. And the scalability is a key source of the business benefits from AI systems, particularly in decision making. And when we have a highly scalable system, there is also a certain risk for systemic risk in terms of discrimination and so on. So to start concluding here, this definition is from a paper published in AI and Ethics, I think last week. We actually worked for quite a bit to get our thoughts straight regarding the definition and consulted a fair bit of literature as well here. You can find more details from the paper. It's open access, made possible by the Finnish taxpayers, so go and have a look. A couple of things maybe I would like to highlight here. First, a systemic perspective to governance. Technical development of algorithms, having KPIs for biases, KPIs for system performance, having mechanisms that allow contesting the decisions made by algorithms. From a systemic standpoint, all this should play well together. And that is kind of the vantage point and the perspective that we try to highlight in our doings. Second key point is the term alignment. Alignment is important. And there are multiple alignments. And these alignments may set somewhat differing requirements for actually AI systems. And this can even mean possible trade-offs that should be carefully considered. So this was a glimpse of why we might need AI governance and what AI governance might entail. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you. And if you want to know more, our project website, ai-governance.eu, is a good starting point. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Matti. That was a very interesting discussion with, as I was just mentioning to you now, a lot of questions that I had in mind to ask you about your work, the article itself, and also beyond the article. The first point I guess I want to focus on is to do with some of the principles, so the guideline documents and the policy documents that you spoke of, which you said are numerous. So you mentioned that there's a need to translate them somehow into practice. And just now you mentioned about the need to translate them technically into something that is technically viable, I guess. I've got two questions for you. The first is, how do you reconcile all of these documents and use them in a meaningful fashion, both the guideline documents and the policy documents? And the second part to that is about the principles themselves, whether you see that there is a foundational principle that should be either emphasized or elevated or highlighted as a stepping stone to this translation work.
Well, first of all, thanks for your kind words. Really good questions. If I start with the question related to the ethical principles and guidelines and maybe the kind of relative importance of those from my vantage point, I think the transparency as such is really important, because that's the foundation, that's the enabler for us as citizens or as stakeholders of AI systems to evaluate how well the other ethical principles might realize or might not realize. So in that sense, I would kind of highlight the foundational role of transparency in making as an enabler. Then related to your second question about how to reconcile between maybe different ethical kind of frameworks, guidelines, and even requirements, that is a very good question, and that's a very big question. In our next paper that is now under preparation, we kind of depict this reconciliation challenge as an hourglass shaped process, where on top of the hourglass we have the stakeholder pressure, we have the regulation, we have the ethical guidelines. And then at an organizational level, when we go kind of to the middle of the hourglass, we have set of processes through which we translate all the good there is in the world, in the upper side of the hourglass, into something that we can then kind of again explode, if you like, into technical implementation in the lower end of the hourglass. But there is so much to say about this thing that maybe at this time I just shut my mouth.
There are so many points, I guess, I'd love to pick up on there, and I might choose maybe one or two. And you're quite right, this is quite a complex situation. Even though your emphasis has been on the organizational level, that leads me to sort of a question that is somewhat related. You displayed a governance framework where you situate AI governance as part of a broader corporate or organizational governance framework. Now, as we're all aware, there's a broader kind of consideration here where you need to think as well beyond the organization, particularly when we're having discussions about regulation, when we're having discussions about law, more specifically, or embedding the particular organization within a societal framework, for example. Do you have any, clues as to where your research is headed in terms of situating that governance structure or framework within a broader, context? Do you have any thoughts about that? And then I might pick up on the translation mechanism, because I think that's quite key.
In terms of our research, we kind of have let's say, a set of key directions, and one direction is looking at the different kind of stakeholders. AI systems have a lot of stakeholders that have really kind of different levels of technical expertise, different kind of expectations, different requirements. And these stakeholders, they can be like real macro level stakeholders like the EU, or they can be micro stakeholders like you and me as citizens or consumers, and then we have everything in between. So kind of, and going back to what you said or asked about this kind of process of reconciliation and translating all this. So kind of this multi-stakeholder perspective is something that interests us at the moment a lot, and for instance related to transparency and explainability. How do we make AI systems explainable and transparent for different stakeholders. What does that mean to each stakeholder group? That is something. Then maybe kind of taking your question, processing it a bit, and then translating it something totally different than you probably even asked. But what we have been kind of investigating is kind of an potential ecosystem for let's say AI governance, but responsible AI in a broader sense as well. Like responsible AI, well-governed AI systems. In fact, that is something that again, going back to the stakeholder perspective, that really kind of, to me at least, requires input and collaboration between different stakeholders. And that also needs, I would say, commercial solutions. How to, for instance, document the behavior of your AI system in such a way that different stakeholder groups get what they want to get in terms of transparency and explainability. We might need kind of so-called police algorithms, because it might be too difficult really for humans to act as in the role of the police. If you think of the processing power of these algorithmic systems. So in fact, I think they need some kind of constant monitoring, potentially kind of constant policing. So that is also something kind of, what is the role of human agency and what is the role of other forms of agency when governing these kind of systems. So maybe these kind of future directions.
That is fantastic. I mean, there are major threads, I think, in everything that you mentioned. And when I think about reflecting about them, I tend to like starting off with a complex socio-technical ecosystems perspective, because it gives you sort of a broader perspective of those different threads to consider, each of which is quite large. But I think in reflecting more specifically about your comments, the main takeaways that at least I took from that is the multi-stakeholder view. There's also the multi-level view that we spoke about before, and that translation mechanism. Now, something that I think is quite important and we focus on quite a lot in our work is how we translate through the inclusion of stakeholders in the design of these systems, taking into account ethics and other considerations as part of a more participatory collaborative process. And it seems, without sort of preempting the direction of your work, in addition to what you said, that there needs to be those participatory processes, but within them, given the nature of AI more specifically, and the, I guess, role it has on changing socio-technical systems and dimensions as we traditionally know them, those participatory approaches might end up being shaped in quite a different way. I think I might end up on one question that sort of touches on some of the stuff we spoke about. So in the recent article that you co-authored in AI and Ethics that you spoke about, and that was titled Defining Organizational AI Governance, you allude to waves of AI scholarship. And just as you were speaking now, I was thinking about the current wave that we're in, that you reference other work to say that we're currently in the third wave that is centered on governed AI. So essentially, as you spoke, going from your ethical principles to practice. Your article was, as we said, concerned with the organizational context. In your assessment, how far into this third wave are we, and what else is required on the part of the academic community, more specifically, to progress either within this wave or toward the fourth wave, however you envisage that? Very big questions. Yes. Yeah, maybe a succinct response, and we can read about the rest in forthcoming work.
Exactly, but maybe kind of as to answer your big question, I would kind of, let's say, give kind of two meta level answers or two meta directions, like just from my spinal cord, so to speak. But I think there is kind of a natural progression in terms of addressing the translation problem of AI ethics. Now we are addressing it through AI governance. But I think there is still a lot of work to be done in the practical and in the academic front equally, in terms of technically implementing and integrating the processes of good AI governance into the day-to-day activities of the people responsible for developing and operating these systems. So that is kind of the one direction. Maybe another direction, kind of a different direction to that. If you consider the first kind of digging deeper and deeper into the technical execution and technical details, the other direction, meta direction, could be then taking an increasingly systemic view of governing algorithmic systems. So looking more and more into the interplay of the different kind of governance layers and governance mechanisms within the organization. So looking into and paying increased attention on the interrelationships between AI governance, corporate governance, IT governance, data governance, and whatnot. So these may be two meta directions could be something.
That's great. And I'm afraid we're out of time. So many questions to ask you, but maybe for a part 2 of this discussion. Thank you so much for your time. And it was great to have a chat with you.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure.
Would like to thank all our speakers for sharing your work and insights today. It's indeed, I think, the beginning of a much broader conversation. And thank you also to Matti Mäntymäki for preparing this presentation. We are unfortunately at the conclusion of our session. Thank you so much to our speakers for staying back. We know it's very late there. We do anticipate and hope that this session will encourage future discussions regarding the intersection of the information systems technology, public interest technology, and the other themes that have been explored today. We thank once again our wonderful guests for joining us for this thought-provoking presentation and for their insights. Thank you to Professor Yogesh Dwivedi, to Associate Professor Denis, Dennehy, to Dr. Anastasia Griva, Professor Xenia Vassilakopoulou, Professor Ilias, Pappas, and Associate Professor Matti Mäntymäki. And thank you to all our live attendees, to Melissa Waite and my co-host, Professor Katina Michael. A quick reminder that the recording for this session, as always, will be available on the School for the Future of Innovation in Society YouTube channel, and we look forward to seeing you for the next installment of the PIC Colloquium, in which we'll continue this discussion on the information systems discipline and public interest technology. Thank you for joining us, and a good afternoon, good night, and good morning to anyone in Australia. Thank you.